Hi, this is Derek, and this week we're going to talk about editing your book. And I have set up the course so that there's basically a month for each part of the process. A month is probably actually too much to plot your book, although I think it was the right amount of time to learn all of the information about plotting that I wanted to share with you. A month is also a little bit fast to actually write your book. It can totally be done by writing 1 or 2,000 words a day, but if you are writing your first book, it can be difficult to get into that kind of a writing habit. And so with editing, there are different authors who have different processes, but for me personally, editing takes about as long as it takes to write. And partly that's because most people will think that editing is just cleaning up the typos, the punctuation, the mistakes. And it actually probably needs to be a lot more in depth, where when you finish your first draft, it's not really a finished book yet, and you're going to have to go through several stages of revision that aren't exactly editing before you have something that's finally ready to polish and clean up. So I'm going to talk you through what my editing process looks like, what you need to be focused on, how to start, when you should be doing what, and all of those things in this video. So with editing, as I mentioned, everyone's really going to develop their own system eventually. It actually takes me probably 7 passes. Once I finish a rough draft, I go through the book over and over again, and each time I make it a little bit better. And often the really good stuff doesn't happen until like the 7th round of revision, when everything is clean, and now I'm finally going through and making it good. So there are different levels to the process. And it's fine, like I mentioned earlier, even if you don't feel your book is great right now, that's still okay. This is just a big process of troubleshooting and removing the barriers or the problems. Once it's all working, we can finally go in and try to make it good. So this is how I've divided up this month. It will look kind of like this. I have a 3-step editing process, which I've talked about before, which is what, why, how. So I'll talk you through that system. And this week we're going to be focused on number 1, which is the what. And then in the 4th week, we'll actually finally get into the final editing and proofreading process. And I'll teach you some strategies and tools that will help make that easier. The value of breaking it up this way is that when you first finish your rough draft, it may feel almost unfixable. I think I mentioned last week, it's also very common to finish a rough draft or be working on something for a long time and just to be exhausted and you just don't want to deal with it anymore. It's very important to take care of your creative mental health and take some time off, and try to feel good about your story again. But it can also be really useful to break things down so that you're not trying to fix everything all at once or feel overwhelmed when you get stuck. So the first week is the what, which is what actually happens. We're not worried about the words yet, or the sentence structure, or even the punctuation typos. Through this process, every time you go through your book, you want to fix whatever you see. So if you see a typo or a spelling mistake, go ahead and fix it. But that's not necessarily what we're looking for right now. Probably when you first finished your rough draft, it's not actually finished. You might have a whole bunch of scenes that don't actually fit together very well. There's going to be some transitional issues. There's going to be a lot of we'll go into a little deeper about what you want to be looking for, but you want to be focused on what's actually happening in the story. So this could be who knows what, a little bit of information. When do the reveals happen? When do they learn about the stuff? And also the when, how do all these different scenes fit together, whether it's a linear timeline or a flashback or a backstory or a reveal. It's got to all, like I mentioned, be part of a domino sequence so that each scene is necessary for triggering the action or the response in the next scene. Typically for me in the first draft, I'm still just finishing the book. I may feel like the book is finished because I got to the end because I wrote that last final battle scene. And actually, when I go back, I realize there are a lot of scenes that are not fleshed out, that are really just little notes or like add this here or figure this out. So it's not even a completed story yet. I may have also skipped some really hard stuff if I couldn't figure out how it works together or why it fits or why it's necessary. So part of it will just be filling in the blanks or the holes that you skipped earlier. The other part will be troubleshooting. So when I read through the rough draft for the first time, now that I know what the end is and I'm reading through it all again, knowing where it's going, I'm going to notice a lot of new things. And I'm probably not going to be ready to fix them because what usually happens is at this stage, you're going to be noticing new problems for the first time, which means you may not have thought about solutions for those problems yet, and you may not be ready to fix them yet. So what you're going to want to do, if you use Microsoft Word like I do or another program, you just want to be leaving notes to yourself. So there's a place where you can add a comment. I'll be reading through and just looking for problems like this doesn't make sense, this is weak or boring, there's nothing happening here, why does this matter? Or anything that just feels off or strange or interrupts the smooth reading experience. That's what you want to comment on. And you're basically just leaving notes to yourself. I'll usually leave dozens of notes in every chapter or almost in every page where I just comment on, this needs to be fixed. I may even say kind of rude comments to myself, like, this sucks, I need to get rid of it, I need to change it. And I may not have the answers or the solutions yet, but by pointing them out, I'll start to be aware of them and I'll start to be thinking about them even as I go through the book. Maybe if I notice a problem in chapter 3, by the time I get to chapter 10, I might realize a solution and then I can go back and add notes or comments. I will also probably, in my manuscript, I will add a place probably at the end. It might be in the beginning where I say like good scenes, and then whenever I have new ideas for changes, I can just add the notes in there. Because if you try to go through your manuscript, if you make hundreds of notes on the side, it can be difficult to go back and find what you wrote. I will also usually, in those comments, add little scene builders. So maybe I'm not ready to edit them into my scene yet, but I just am brainstorming, a handful of really strong sentences while I'm in the flow and I have some ideas. Rather than, it's harder to edit the work than it is to write something new, and you may struggle with this also. So rather than seeing a problem and trying to fix it right away, I can just, in my comment, rewrite it basically better. And then later I'll go through and I'll try to take all of those notes that I made or those rewritten passages and assimilate them into the scene. But like I was saying, you may want to have a place at the beginning where you collect all of that really important new idea stuff that you've been brainstorming. You might want to copy and paste it there. And you may also want to have a place at the beginning or end of deleted scenes or excerpts. So maybe while you're going through, maybe you have a really strong paragraph that just doesn't fit there and you don't want to delete it. You just want to move it somewhere for now until you figure out where it's actually going to go. So it's useful to have a place in your manuscript where you can store that kind of stuff. Either it's story questions or notes or scenes that don't really work, but you're not really ready to delete or give up on. And that's kind of just another place. So at this stage, at the what stage, a lot of it is just rearranging and moving around or fixing problems or becoming aware of new problems for the first time. So in week 2, it'll focus on the why, which is more of the why does this need to happen? Why does it matter? So it's the emotional depth, it's the motivation, the stakes, the intrigue, the conflict. So you're going to have to decide whether, if you have a scene where nothing is happening or it doesn't seem relevant to the plot, you either have to delete it or you have to make it matter by introducing more stakes or intrigue or conflict or motivation, or like whatever. There can be a whole scene that's just for fun where nothing is really happening, but it's just kind of a nice, interesting scene where something big shifts or happens at the end, or even like it's a little trivial piece of information that comes out in the conversation. The whole scene is okay as long as you have that one little piece. So you can find ways to salvage a scene if you want to keep it, which is what this week will be focused on, this second week, next week. So the what is just kind of finishing the story and making it make sense. And then the why will be going back in and deepening the emotional resonance, increasing the conflict, the stakes, the drama, and also fixing the motivation so that there's clear reasons for your characters to be doing those things. Sometimes your characters may do things for bad reasons, which can make them, they can make it unbelievable. They can make the story unbelievable, or they can make your characters unlikable if they're doing things that don't really make a lot of sense. If there's something else they could have done that would have been easier or less dangerous or made more sense, they should do that. So if you don't want them to do that, like you have to at least comment on they couldn't do the easy thing because whatever, like they had to think of it, offer it up as an idea, and then block it because there's some reason or obstacle why they didn't want to do it the easy way. So you can force them down the more difficult path to get them to go where you want them to go, but you have to also address why didn't they just do the easy thing, because your readers will be asking those kind of questions. In the third week, we will focus on the description, which is how does everything actually look when it's happening. So this is the background scene description. It's their expressions or their movement or their what they're wearing, keeping track of what the weapons look like, what the weather is, all of that stuff, which is really important, but doesn't really matter until you have the what and the why, because these are more important, which is why we don't really focus on the description until late in the editing process. I really love this part. I really love the world building and the scene description. So we'll talk a lot about that in week 3, but not right now. And then finally, in the 4th week, which is kind of the final polish, you should have already kind of read through it 3 times. And now you will be going back and looking for actually fixing the problems. So partly this is the typos, spelling errors, punctuations, and that's also important. I think you can use Microsoft Word's default spelling and grammar check to catch a lot of problems. I also use Grammarly, which is, I believe you can get Grammarly for free and use it with Microsoft Word. Not for all of the features, but at least the basic spelling feature, which is the only one I really use, I think is free. So you could try that out. Also, you might catch some extra things. And it is important to catch all the typos and to clean it up, but you don't really want to worry about it until you have all this stuff in the right place. Because when you're still moving things around, it's even when you do rewrites, what I often find is, by week 3, when I'm doing the final rewrites and adding in the new content, I'm still writing new content for the first time. So it's very easy to introduce new spelling mistakes or typos, even when you've gone through it several times. So you always want to be making sure you do a final check or a final polish. And it's difficult to catch everything, which is okay, but you want to catch as much as possible. The other thing we're going to be focused on week 4 is the first paragraphs and the ending hooks and the conclusions. Basically, your first chapter and your last chapter are super important, but also the first couple paragraphs and the last couple paragraphs of each scene or each chapter are also really important, because that's what's going to keep the momentum and keep people flipping through your book. It's really easy to kind of end a scene on a weak ending, and you also want to end at the max drama, so that just when something interesting happens, you stop and you cut it off and you force them to turn the page to keep reading to find out what happens next. And the other thing we're going to be looking at in the fourth week is repetition, consistency, and details. Repetition is basically when you will be repeating the same words. It's really easy to do when you're writing. You'll probably have words that you kind of rely on, and sometimes your brain just does weird things where you will just keep using the same word. So during that final editing and proofreading stage, whenever you see the same word being repeated too often, I don't like having the same word within the same paragraph. Like he walked over there and she walked over there. If it's a really simple verb, it's okay. The more unusual or interesting the word, the more it's going to stand out. So, for example, one of my pet peeves is the word purchase, but not as in to buy something, but as in to grip. So if I say like her sneakers gained purchase on the rocky cliff face, that might be okay once or twice in a book, but if it happens, in the same page, it's really going to stand out. So you want to kind of become aware of your writing habits or any unusual words that you use and see how often they're coming up. But even common words can get really annoying if they're repeated too frequently. So that's when you would go through and just try to vary the word choice a little bit so that you're not repeating the same things. It's also really important to avoid repeating the same content. For example, if the information is already known, if the characters already know the information and the readers already know the information, there's no sense having a dialogue where they're just repeating the same stuff. It is important to every once in a while remind readers what's happening, which can be like every 3 or 4 chapters, your characters may want to remind each other why they're doing what they're doing, what their goals are, why they're going to do it, what they're doing next. Just as a way to kind of check in. Maybe it's been a while since they talked about, what's going on, and you don't want to avoid the really big main stuff. Like maybe the antagonist hasn't showed up for 3 or 4 chapters, but you can't have your characters just forget that there's looming imminent danger. So every once in a while, they have to think about, whatever happened with that thing. What are we going to do about this big overarching story narrative? You don't want to go too long without remembering the stakes, because those little in between scenes can be really good and dramatic, but not if the characters seem like they've forgotten about the important story stuff that you introduced earlier on. Whenever there's a phrase, something like waiting for the other shoe to drop or waiting for the hammer to drop or something. Once you've introduced the conflict and the stakes, readers are going to get dissatisfied and frustrated quickly when your characters just go on with their lives and forget about those bigger things. It's possible there's nothing they can do right now and they have other more pressing issues that they're distracted with. But when they have some downtime, you want to keep reminding readers and characters what they're doing. And you can even, sometimes I'll do something like before they're about to go off on a quest, you can remind them of the stakes, where one character will, I think in my latest book, it was something like, one character said something like, okay, great. So all we need to do is break into a compound and steal some elixir and avoid the vampires and blah, blah, blah. So it's basically just like a bullet point list of the story objectives, the quest goals, and the stakes and the obstacles and the oppositions, but doing it in kind of a fun, flippant, sarcastic way, so that the readers are reminded, the characters are talking about what the stakes and the story quests are, which you can do every once in a while. But if every chapter or two they're repeating the same dialogue, where they're repeating the same thing. For example, if someone feels really bad because they left somebody behind, and every other page they're remembering how they left the person behind and how badly they feel about it, that's going to get annoying really quickly. So if readers already know something and the characters have already had this conversation, or the main characters already had these paralyzing fears or doubts, you don't want to keep going over the same content over and over again. because it can get really annoying, and it's not new content, so it's not pulling anything forward. You definitely want to have that content in there, but if you notice, like, I've already said this, the characters already thought these things, or they've already had this discussion, you're going to want to boil those down to one place and remove the places that are repetitive. You're also going to want to look for consistency. So it can get really easy to overlook things that are not consistent. Like, she wasn't wearing sneakers before, and now suddenly she has sneakers. This can be you may need to problem solve where in this scene she needs to have a weapon. So you have to figure out, when did she get that weapon? And you can't, like, the first fix is just she pulled out her sword or whatever, which is fine because you added it. And you may even add a fix like she pulled out her sword, which she had gone back and stolen out of her boyfriend's tent. You know, like, you can add a little note to yourself immediately before the problem to problem solve by fixing it in the moment, which is okay, but actually can be a little heavy handed. If you fix the problem at the same time that the problem needs to be solved, it's just a little bit too obvious. So, what you really have to do is go back several chapters and show her getting that sword, so that when it when the scene happens where she pulls it out, you've already explained that she has a sword. So keeping track of those objects, when did those objects, get there? Where were they? Who put the thing where, when? That kind of thing is the consistency and the details work, which is pretty late editing stuff, but it's kind of important for believability or consistency, just because you don't want them to have a magical hat where they can just pull everything out of wherever. A really interesting thing, just while I'm thinking of it, I think it's in the sixth Harry Potter novel where he needs to get Gryffindor's sword, but they are out in the wilds hiding from the Death Eaters. So for some reason, somehow, Gryffindor's sword just kind of appears in this lake. So that's kind of a really, um, like, you can always make magic happen if it's a fantasy and just have objects appear, as long as it's believable in the world of the story. It's okay. And that solves the problem of, Harry needed the sword, but it was impossible and foolish if he would have had to go back into Hogwarts and try to steal it. Or I think the sword was stolen or lost previously. So there was this story problem of, how do we get Harry the sword that he's going to need eventually to defeat Voldemort? Although I think in 7, it's actually Neville Longbottom who has the sword. Anyway, it's been a long time since I've read Harry Potter, but that's kind of what I mean by the consistency or the details. You've got to problem solve, how do the characters have the things that they need at the right time? Where were these obstacles or details before? And that might be something that you don't really figure out until pretty late in the editing process. But anyway, this week is just the first pass, which is the what actually happened. So I'm just going to talk a little bit about what you could be doing this week. A lot of it I've already covered, so I'll try to go through it a little faster. First one is just what's actually happening in the scene. And you can think about, is it interesting? Is what's happening interesting? And to some extent, why does it matter? It's okay in the first chapter, in the first scene, to have it where you haven't flushed out all the backstory details. They may not know exactly why it matters. You can have interesting stuff happening without explaining what's going on exactly, by adding something a little bit mysterious or supernatural if it's a fantasy. If it's a sci-fi, you can just introduce the world to make it interesting. You can introduce, the normal day life in a sci-fi novel might be already really different and unique from the regular world. So as long as you have interesting stuff happening and you're doing all the character building stuff and making the character sympathetic in the first chapter, you have some conflict and suspense and intrigue. You can't just start with info dumps or backstory or too much of an ordinary day. You have to be including conflict and drama, not like huge world changing stakes drama in the first couple chapters, but there should be conflict. So I would be trying to focus on those 3 points of conflict and also the scene checklist that I shared earlier. You probably also want to be focused on the transition, which just means they were here and now they need to go over here. Someone asked a question in one of my groups this week about whether you talk about the bathroom scenes. So the bathroom scenes are, they're going to the bathroom, they're brushing their teeth, they're taking showers. Do you include that stuff? And the answer is you only include it if it's necessary for the story. So if something happens in the bathroom that's necessary for character development or for story progression, then it's okay. Otherwise, you don't. You skip it. Sometimes, for example, in my latest book, they had just gone out and done a mission and she killed a werewolf. So she was basically drenched in werewolf blood. So before they go back to the headquarters, like it makes sense for them to stop at a stream and to wash off a little bit because they're disgusting and smelly. So they don't want to go back to the headquarters. It could have made sense for them to go back and take a shower. But there's also a part where one of her allies turned into a werewolf and they had to wait until he becomes human again. So there were reasons for them to stop and wash off. So it can make sense in the story, but also in that story scene, while they're bathing in the stream, there's some really good dialogue and conversation, which I didn't really have anywhere else to put. Like it's kind of a little break between the attack sequence and then going back into the headquarters where they're going to have more drama with other people. So it's kind of like a nice little, oh crap, did that just happen? I can't believe we survived kind of bonding moment. But it's a similar question to, do you show the transition? If they have to go from point A to point B, do you show them on the train or in the car or making that journey? And the quick answer is no, you skip until they arrive. Like you show the point of them figuring out where they have to go next, and then you show them arriving at the new location, and you might comment like it took 36 hours to get there by plane or whatever, but you don't have to show that entire journey because probably nothing is really happening on that journey that makes it relevant. If they have stuff to talk about, they could talk, like you could say they slept the whole journey because they were tired, and then they actually, that's why they don't actually talk to each other until they arrive at the new place, and then they're like, now they can start talking and dialoguing again. So it's fine to skip whatever's not interesting, or passages of time. Like if 3 weeks happens before something interesting happens again, you can skip those 3 weeks. You don't have to do a blow by blow of what happened during the time that nothing interesting was happening. You want to skip right to the scenes where there is some conflict. So if you have scenes where nothing's really happening or there's no conflict, those might be places you need to skip or cut, especially if it's transition stuff. You may also be thinking about the details, which are like the who, where, what, how. I know this is confusing because this week is just the what, but with details, who is in the scene, why are they there, where were they before, where did they come from? Sometimes it's tricky to keep track of. For example, one scene I really struggled with in this book was which characters go on this mission and why. So they discovered the next mission, they have to infiltrate the kingdom and steal a key from the library, basically. So the main character is going to go but I had to figure out which of the other side characters go with her. And it doesn't really matter because in this scene, she really does that on her own, and then she escapes on her own. So it's really just there's a little bit of dialogue or conversation in the beginning when they sneak in, but after that, it doesn't really matter. But the problem was I had to figure out why the other characters wouldn't go because um, like one of the other main characters is already pissed off that she didn't get included in the last mission, so she would have really wanted to go on this mission. She would have really like forced them to let her go. So it's kind of difficult. Like I didn't have a reason for her to be in this scene, so I wanted to leave her back at home, but it didn't really make sense, and I'm not even sure if I really solved it very well. I think in my editing phase, I had meant to say something like, she is very, her complexion is almost albino. She's from the north, so she's going to stand out a lot more than anybody else. And so I think I said something like, she's too recognizable. She's going to stand out, even though the other characters are more infamous and would be recognized anyway. It doesn't have to, by plausible, it doesn't really have to hold up to scrutiny because readers aren't really going to spend a lot of time thinking about it, but you have to figure out some reason or some excuse that's potentially logical enough to make sense and mention it, so that readers don't ask the question of like, why didn't she go? Where was she? Why did she stay home? That doesn't make any sense. You don't want them to ask the question. So you have to at least give them some plausible excuse or reason, even if it's not great, just to mention why they did things the way that they did. And actually, of the two characters who did go, one of them got shot by a crossbow recently. The other one just had her arm broken. So, like, it would have been easier for them not to go by explaining their injuries and leaving them behind. But I had a really neat scene where one of the characters who went on the mission did something in character for her in that scene, and it wouldn't have made sense to swap out the other character because it wouldn't have suited her personality, and I wanted to keep what I had. So I kind of had to like play around with the motivations and justifications to excuse the reasons that I had these characters in this scene. So it's not a huge deal, but just a sentence. I think it's just a sentence or two that explains, like, Camino was going to stay home because she's too recognizable, and Luke and Jasmine decided to go with me because they knew the city. Like, it's one or two sentences, but it's enough that readers know what's happening and why it's happening. And then this final one is just, is it necessary? And what I mean by that is, does something happen in the scene that is relevant later? I think we talked a lot about this before, but does it matter for the end of the novel? Does it matter to help the characters get to where they need to be, to have all the right information, to make the choices that they need to make to get you to the end of the book? Sometimes it's just something like character deepening. So maybe they learn a little bit more about a backstory or a back character. Even if it's not directly relevant, it helps them because it makes them feel more about a side character. It might bring up some feelings of guilt, or it might make them put themselves at risk later or take other choices that they wouldn't have taken if they didn't know the stuff that they know now. So even if it's just like a little bit of new information, it might be critical later. So it's okay to have scenes that are, it's also like I mentioned, it's fine to have some scenes that are just, is the world worth saving scenes, where it's really just a fun and happy scene. Although I still think you should end those scenes on a twist or a conflict or something. But it's okay to just kind of show the world building a little bit where it's not absolutely necessary or critical for the final outcome, but you're still deepening the character's responsibility or loyalty to the other characters or to the world. But even so, there should always be something new in every scene. There should be new information. There should be new sources of conflict, or there should always be something that they're trying to do. Every scene should be, you know, first they react or respond or regroup to what just happened at the end of the last scene. Then they make a new plan based on the new information or based on the results of the last action that they took. They make a new plan to take more action, and then something happens. Hopefully, something actually happens, which means there's real action. It's not just a lot of thinking or a dream sequence or talking about stuff. It's them, and they don't always have to take action, like to go on a mission every scene, but they should always have some new thought or realization that leads them to a new quest. It could even just be like new information that gets them asking certain questions so that later when something happens, they remember that thought that they had and they put the pieces together and they realize something that induces them to take action or make a new plan. Also, it should always be a little bit related to the overarching story, drama, or quest. So even if it's just like a little episode or an anecdote, I don't know why I keep going back to Harry Potter, but that's just kind of an easy one because everybody knows it. So even in Harry Potter, most of the books, like in book 3 and 4, a lot of that stuff, the Triwizard competition or whatever, it's not, well, on the one hand, it's not directly related to the entire series quest, which is about the conflict with Voldemort or the return of Voldemort and Harry Potter. Really, like it's just homework and school and stuff happening with Draco or Snape. Like it's smaller world stuff that has conflict. It's its own story, and that's fine. Um, but it's usually, I think, resolved. Like even that little stuff that was happening, it was intrigue and suspense because they didn't know what was really happening or why it was happening. But I think by the end of the book, the reveal is usually, this is because of Voldemort. He's actually the reason that these little things were happening. And even I think in like the Triwizard Cup, he's he needs a spell to be able to breathe underwater, to be able to compete um, and win the competition. But actually, at the end of the last quest, it was all a setup because Harry Potter and Cedric Diggory were kidnapped by Voldemort. So like it seemed incidental, but it was actually necessary and part of the overarching conflict. And I just point this out because it's really easy to get distracted with other little things that aren't really related to the bigger picture. And you always want to make sure that like the biggest source of conflict and danger and drama, that's the most interesting part of your book. So if you have little episodes that are not related to that, readers might feel cheated because they'll be thinking, why does this matter? Why is this important? When the stakes are so low and the danger are so low, why are characters worried about doing this little stuff when there's bigger stuff out there that they should be worried about? So, one final thing, you may have heard of this rule. If not, I'll explain it briefly. But a really common piece of writing advice is show, don't tell, which means you need to think about what does this actually look like. So, if you are telling the readers information directly with words, but you're not showing them what it looks like, that's show don't tell. So for example, I could say she was really nervous. That's okay to sometimes use language like that and tell readers what was happening. You can just say, Katie was so nervous about her test. And that's not terrible, but it could be a lot better if you also try to think, how does that look like in a scene. When you're focused on the description or trying to make your novel better, you want to be trying to put pictures into readers' heads. So if you tell them Katie was really nervous, readers understand what that means. Um, they understand the words, but they're not seeing a picture. And you want your writing to be as visual as possible so that they can see the pictures in their heads, kind of like they're watching a movie. So instead of Katie was really nervous to take her test, which is also okay, you can think about, and we'll talk a lot more about this later in the description process, but you can think about what it would look like for Katie to be nervous. If somebody else was in the room, how would they know that Katie was nervous? Either she has to tell somebody in conversation, like, I'm so nervous, or you have to write it in a way that makes it visual. So I could say, Katie was, well, I could do both. I could say Katie was actually, okay, I'm going to stop myself. It's hard to think through description out loud, but it would be something like Katie paced the floor, clutching her notebooks nervously as she walked down the hall. Her brow was prickling with sweat. She forgot to study for this test, and it was really important to keep her grades up, or else she would get grounded again. As she walked slowly into the classroom, a feeling of dread swept through her body. So something like that is a lot more specific and a lot more interesting than telling readers Katie was nervous. So that's the basic thing. In earlier videos, I'm pretty sure I also mentioned it's really important to think about who is doing the telling. Like, all of everything that happens should probably be through the lens of a character. So you show what's happening based on its relevancy to the character. If the characters are not talking about or noticing what's happening, or if they're just standing there while the author or the narrator is telling this information to readers directly, that can be a problem. So whenever possible, you want to tie it into what the characters are actually doing or saying or feeling, rather than just dumping the info outside of the character experience. And you want to be thinking about, how does this look? Can I picture this as a scene, or are these just words? It's really difficult to always show instead of tell. It's actually fine to do a little bit of both. You kind of want to try to avoid doing both at the same time. If I said Katie was really nervous, she walked slowly into the classroom clutching her notebooks, that's okay. Sometimes they can be paired together like that and it can make sense. But if it's done too much, then it can come across as repetition. If I've already told you that she was nervous, I don't need to also tell you, the way that she's walking nervously into the classroom. So this is a really important guideline, but it's also really difficult to teach and to talk about. So what I'd actually like to do is find some examples, and we'll talk more about this later. I'm also going to ask you, if you want to post some of your work for feedback, you could do that in the comments. I would recommend posting the first 1,000 words of your book. You could do it now, or you could wait until after you've gone through several rounds of revision and share it a little bit later. The first 1,000 words of your book are really important. That's about the first 3 pages. So that's what probably needs the most work and is the hardest to get right. So it might be really valuable for me to help you critique that. But you could also just pick any scene that you like or anything that you want to share, up to 1,000 words. I won't have time probably to go back and give feedback on on everybody, but I'll try. And I may also hopefully be able to use some of those examples so that later, if we're talking about show, don't tell, I can try to pick out some examples and rewrite them a bit and try to explain this rule a little bit better. So that's all for this week. I hope that you're excited about having finished your first draft, and I'm looking forward to this month because I think most of the really good writing stuff, the magic happens in the later phases of the editing. So you may feel more comfortable with the first draft, or you may feel more comfortable. For me, I like having the first draft done because then I know I can focus on the revision and the making it better. That's what I feel a little stronger and more comfortable with. But I also think my best writing, my best words usually comes really late in the editing phases. So there's like, you kind of have to go through it 3 or 4 times to do the problem solving and to fix the big issues before you can go down. There's a metaphor about the trees and the forests. So in the beginning, you don't want to focus on the individual trees because nobody's really paying attention to that anyway. You have to look at the big picture stuff, the big picture problems, and resolve those first to make sure that they fit and they make sense, and it all flows together. But the really cool stuff happens when everything's already in the right place and you can go back in and you can really fine tune the exact scene descriptions or the details. And that's when your novel can get much stronger and really impactful. So anyway, that's all for this week. While you're doing your read through, keep an eye out for a few good pages, 1,000 words or so, that you want to share with the group, and you can post those in the comments and I will try to get back to you with some feedback.